that. Okay, let's look at the last phrase here. Ru'ach Elohim merechefat al panei ha-mayim. So, what does this mean? Well, over here it's translated in English. The Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. What exactly does that mean? I mean, that's kind of obscure in and of itself. So here, let's take a first look at this word ruach. Now, ruach, as you note up in the little box, the extra information box, means spirit, breath, or wind. And that's an interesting problem because there is no single term in English that translates ruach. Sometimes in the Old Testament it means spirit, sometimes it means breath, sometimes it means wind. And we tend to say, well, what did the Hebrew author intend? Which of those three ideas did he intend to use? That's the wrong approach. For the Hebrews, it was all one thing. Your spirit, your breath, and your wind were exactly the same thing. And unfortunately, in English, we have to translate it. We have to say either spirit, breath, or wind here. Does the Spirit of God come upon the face of the waters? Does the wind of God come? Is the wind and Spirit of God the same thing? Remember in John 3, Christ talks to Nicodemus about the Spirit being like the wind, and in Aramaic it would be the Ruach is like the Ruach, right? It's would be a little bit confusing. The Spirit is like a wind. It is a wind, in other words. And of course, your breath, when you breathe and speak, you create wind. You create this breath, which is in fact your wind coming out of you. We say that sometimes in English, right? I lost my wind. I got winded. Things like that. So it's important to note that spirit here is or rather ruach in Hebrew, is a much more complex idea than simply spirit. If you look at the Hebrew lexicon here, you get a number of different concepts associated with it. Here is ruach as breeze or breath, so the idea of air, all right? Go down a little bit further, it's breeze. So, it can be just a normal breeze blowing across the countryside or in the evening or something. Then it's wind. 100 times it's used as wind. That's probably a wrong way to phrase it. 100 times it implies something in Hebrew that we would associate with wind. Or some of those times it might be better associated with spirit or breath. Is the wind the breath of God? Here you've got wind again, and then wind associated with God. God forms the winds, God's winds blow, things like that. Then you've got breath, which supports life. This is breathing, right? And then you've got a little further down, more of a abstract sense of mind. What is your spirit? Are you in good spirits? We use it that way a little bit in English as well. Are you in a good frame of mind? And finally, the Spirit of God. It sometimes says explicitly Ruach Elohim. Does that mean Ruach Elohim mean Spirit of God, breath of God, wind of God? Or is it best translated Ruach of God? That might be the best way to do it. And then finally, you've got Ruach Kadosh, the Holy Spirit, a sacred spirit, which I think is another way of saying the Spirit of God. Now, of course, from a Christian perspective, this creates some interesting issues of, when are we talking about here Ruach as Spirit of God, as the Holy Spirit is understood in a Christian sense? Does the Old Testament ever use the term in that way? That's another interesting problem. At any rate, what we have is the Ruach of God, the Ruach of Elohim. And this term means to flutter, to fly, to hover. That might be an all right what way to describe it, but probably it's using the term like a bird would flutter across the waters. So God's Spirit is hovering and flying, floating, fluttering across the al pnei hamayim, upon the face of the waters. That means the surface of the water. So you can imagine a big lake, and you see a wind blow, and it causes ripples or something like that. That's probably the concept that they're trying to give here. Now, what seems to be going on to me is that God is breathing into the Tehom, and his breath flows across the Tehom. And what happens when God's breath enters the Tehom? It becomes alive, it becomes created, and from that, God is going to create light, because every time God speaks, what happens? God says, "Let there be light," and if you say that and hold your hand in front of your face, you will feel your breath, your spirit, your wind coming out of you. And when God speaks, his spirit comes, and every time his spirit comes, something is created, something happens, things come alive. So the way I understand it is something along the lines of there was a chaotic wasteland, there was nothing but darkness, and there was dead waters, these tahom, these kind of primordial waters, and God's Spirit flows across those waters, and suddenly they're changed, they're transformed, and creation can occur because the Spirit of God is there. So that's the sense I get from this passage. If you look at the Greek, you get the same type of thing. Kai pneuma theo, epiferato, epano to hudatos. The Spirit, and notice in Greek, wind, breath, spirit, same thing. The Spirit of God, and in the New Testament, the Spirit of God, is equated by Christians with the Holy Spirit. And it is brought or carried, here it's more of a passive sense. It's the Spirit of God is pushed across or brought to or carried to. Over, here it's not literally face, but they've abstracted it to over, to hudatos, just the water. That's the ordinary term for water. And then in Latin, it's exactly the same. Et spiritus Dei ferabatur, was born, carried over, super, above, over the aquas, the water. Now, this is an interesting issue, too, when you look at the concept of spirit here in Latin, because our term spirit obviously derives from the Latin. We have some other versions of this. Inspiration is to get the Spirit brought into you. Respiration is to have the Spirit or your breath or your wind come in and out. Expire is to breathe out or to die. When your spirit leaves you, you die. So this link between breath and spirit is kind of hidden a little bit in English, but it's certainly there based on the same ancient concept, that your spirit is your breath, and it is like a wind. And the wind of God is the Spirit of God, and it's the breath of God. And notice here, with God's Spirit comes upon the face of the waters, enlivening the waters. Later on, God will breathe into Adam and make him come alive as well. So the Spirit as something that vivifies is a very important concept. And that, of course, the ancient Hebrews saw because of the way our bodies work. When we stop breathing, we're dead. When we start breathing, we're alive. So that having the back breath, the Spirit in you, is equated with life. So here they describe life entering into this primordial chaos, this tehom, as the Spirit of God coming into it, which creates kind of an interesting concept here of how God's Spirit enlivens us. And of course, in the New Testament, this becomes the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, enlivening and bringing life and a second birth to the Christians, just as the first time the Spirit enters you, that is your breath, you become alive in a physical sense. So that metaphor in Christianity, I think, is a lot stronger when we recognize the ancient concept here, which is somewhat distinct from the way we conceptualize things.